On the 18th of November 1947, staff opened the doors of Ballantynes Department Store in Christchurch, New Zealand. It was another ordinary-seeming day at this respected and long-established retailer. Throughout the sprawling store, hundreds of tailors, shop assistants, cooks, accountants and managers prepared for what they believed would be another ordinary day of work. For some, however, this particular day would be their last. Ballantynes Department Store began as a tiny store run from a residential address in 1854. It sold fabrics, clothing, hats and other similar items under the name Dunstable House. It established itself and grew at a moderate pace until 1872, when it was purchased by businessman and entrepreneur John Ballantyne. Under his leadership, the growth of the company accelerated. Ballantyne's approach to business was to always strive for honourable and upright dealings, a philosophy that ensured that his businesses were trusted and held in high regard by consumers. In the late 1800s, he passed on the company to his sons, who continued his work with the same values in mind. By the turn of the century, smaller branches of Ballantynes had been established in other cities. The original Christchurch branch continued to expand both in terms of the number of customers it served and the variety of goods it dealt in. From the 1900s onwards, business was so good at this store that the company was able to purchase one adjacent building after another, until the Christchurch branch of Ballantynes occupied a complex of 7 buildings, taking up the corner of an entire city block. Each of these buildings was of different construction and had different quirks and characteristics. Some were so old that they did not have elevators, while others were relatively modern. For the most part, the buildings in the sprawling complex were constructed of brick or stone, with interiors that were decorated with carpeting, fiberboard, and Pinex, a type of softwood structural board. To give the complex a unified feel, the party walls between several of the buildings were strategically demolished, turning 7 disparate buildings into one huge department store that customers could wander through with ease. Visitors could purchase clothing, furnishings, artwork, shoes, and carpets all in one place, and then head up to the first floor for a break in a well-appointed tea room. Above their heads on the second floor, hundreds of staff would be hard at work every day on all the tasks necessary to run the store. Up here could be found the credit department, as well as large workshops for tailoring and the customization of clothes. Many clothes, hats and shoes were also made or finished on site in workshops on this floor. There was also a basement level to the complex which was mainly used for storage. On the 18th of November 1947 at around 3:31 p.m, a staff member on the ground floor of Ballantynes Department Store noticed smoke rising up a staircase from the basement. He went to investigate and noted that there was a significant amount of hot smoke, and that the lights in the basement were flickering. He fetched a fire extinguisher and, backed up by another employee, ventured down into the basement again to try and fight the fire, but was forced to retreat when the lights went out altogether. The fire brigade was called and were on scene by 3:48 p.m. They had dealt with many fires in cellars and basements before, and few had been serious. Nonetheless, firefighters advised that the lower floors of the building be evacuated as a precaution. They began to prepare a hose, ready to enter and extinguish what they believed was a small, manageable fire. At this stage, traces of smoke were visible in the air in different parts of the store. Some staff, either following the instructions issued by the fire brigade or on their own initiative, began to evacuate customers. In some departments, however, staff were instructed to stand by and await further instructions before taking any action. While this was happening, the fire was becoming rapidly more established. A huge pool of smoke darkened the sky above the complex. At 3:50 p.m, up on the second floor, owner Ken Ballantyne opened a fire escape door and was greeted by a wall of thick black smoke. At around the same time, the electric lights began to flicker and fail. He instructed workers in the credit office to secure sensitive documents before they evacuated. This involved carrying dozens of bins of documents and materials, along with several typewriters and adding machines, to a strong room. Unwilling to disobey a man who owned the business they worked for, the credit office employees began to do so. Elsewhere, smoke was infiltrating the millinery department. At 3:56 p.m., a supervisor attempted to lead their employees to safety down a fire escape. Only the supervisor and one other employee made it out. 6 others were overwhelmed by smoke on the way and did not escape. By this time, the fire brigade had begun setting up ladders outside the building. One man, a member of the New Zealand Air Force who happened to be passing by, used a fire brigade ladder to climb up to the tea room on the first floor, where customers were enjoying refreshments and listening to a string quartet. He burst in and started trying to persuade the patrons there to evacuate. He recalls that they seemed bemused by his sudden appearance, and he was able only to take 2 people with him out of the building. At 3:57 p.m., several windows on the front of the building exploded from the heat and pressure within. The fire, which minutes ago had appeared small and under control, was now firmly established and out of control. Survivors later described it as a wall of flame that moved at the pace of a swift run. Smoke and flames spread easily throughout the open-plan building. Smoke rose through elevator shafts and open stairwells, filtering up to the second floor where dozens of employees were still trapped. The operation to control the fire was chaotic. A mile-wide pool of smoke above the store drew hundreds of onlookers to the scene. At times, firefighters had to push their way through a dense crowd to reach telephones in order to call for more resources. In 2 instances, fire hoses were directed at crowds, once to push them back from a wall that might collapse, and a second time to move them off the roof of a building across the street, which firefighters were worried might collapse because of the number of people gathered on it. By now, dozens of people could be seen at windows on the first and second floors of Ballantynes waving or banging on the glass to try and attract attention. Firefighters struggled to get ladders into position to rescue them, however, as Ballantynes was surrounded by a rigid veranda that prevented fire engines from parking directly adjacent to the building. Up in the credit department, employees had finished stowing their work materials in the strong room. The documents and adding machines they had worked to save would ultimately survive the fire. The workers themselves, however, had spent so long on the task that they were left with few options to escape the fire themselves. Around this time, 3 female employees jumped or fell from windows. One landed on the road and later died from her injuries. The other 2 landed on the veranda and survived with serious injuries. Ken Ballantyne was seen waving from a second-floor window. A ladder was put in place, but it was too short. 2 fire hoses were directed at him to provide some cover, while a longer ladder was secured. He was ultimately rescued, albeit with some injuries. At least 20 employees of the credit office he had overseen did not survive. Ken Ballantyne was the last person to be rescued from the complex. He was removed from the building at 4:10 p.m., approximately 20 minutes after he had first seen smoke. After his rescue, several other attempts to extricate people from the building failed, with ladders collapsing or catching fire before they could be used. In total, 41 people, almost all of them staff who had been employed on the upper floors of the complex, died in this fire. It was and remains the worst building fire in New Zealand's history. In the aftermath of the fire, a commission of inquiry explored the circumstances surrounding the disaster. The initial cause of the fire could not be determined, although it was strongly suspected to be an electrical fault or discarded cigarette. However, the Commission did pinpoint many things about the unique complex of buildings that had made the fire less survivable. The open-plan design was one. Although there were shutters to separate different parts of the building, these had to be operated by hand, and there was no time to do so during the disaster. Additionally, there was no sprinkler system and no alarm system throughout the store. Some of the buildings that made up the complex did not have fire escapes, and almost all were lined with flammable materials and filled with flammable stock. Fire extinguishers were available, but staff had not been trained in their use, and there was no coordinated approach to evacuation in the event of a fire. In many cases, the department store had not been in compliance with existing fire safety regulations, but had continued to operate due to loopholes. The fact that clothing was made on the premises, for example, allowed parts of the building to be treated as a factory for the purposes of inspections. Some buildings in the complex had been built at a time when fewer fire escapes were required and simply had not been brought up to code for 1947. A mass funeral was held for those who had died at Ruru Lawn Cemetery in Bromley. A memorial rose garden was established there and is maintained to this day. Ballantynes continued to trade in Christchurch, using the parts of the complex that hadn't been damaged by the fire. Those parts which had been damaged were rebuilt. When they reopened, they did so with brand new fire alarm systems and with staff who were trained in how to respond in an emergency. These changes did not affect only Ballantynes. Most other large retailers in the country were similarly poorly prepared for a fire. The devastating images of the Ballantyne fire prompted a wave of modernization that made hundreds of public buildings significantly more safe over the course of the decades which followed.